Hey guys, it's Mr. Schmidt here, and in this video, we're going to do some practice with bank balance sheets. And so you're going to find these three practice problems under the goals and instruction document for April 8th through 9th. There's a link in there that will take you to these three problems. If you want to go ahead and try them first, and then I'm going to work through each one. The slideshow that link will take you to also has the answer key embedded in that document as well. But I thought it was a good idea to go ahead and explain how to do each one of these just to make sure we all understand. So let's start with this first one here with Bob and depositing $1,000 into the bank. And so what I like to do immediately when I see one of these is I pay attention to what are the numbers, what do I have here? So on the asset side, remember that's what a bank owns, right? So let me go ahead and put that in here. What the bank owns. Sorry, it's a weird W. So what the bank owns is assets, and then what the bank owes is liabilities, okay? And so we can see the bank has required reserves of $2,000. Remember, that's what the bank has to keep in reserve to meet the reserve requirement to avoid bank runs, that kind of thing. Excess reserves are $3,000 at this point, so that's what the bank is choosing to keep in reserve. Doesn't have to, but that's what they're choosing to keep in reserve. They've got $5,000 of treasury bonds, so these are IOUs that the bank owns from the government. And then we've got loans of $15,000. So this is money that the bank has lent out to the average person on the street. Demand deposits is $20,000, and then owner's equity is $5,000, and those are liabilities, things that the bank owes to other people. So with that out of the way, we've got the scenario here that Bob is going to deposit $1,000 into the bank. And the first question is, what is the required reserve ratio? That's another way of saying the reserve requirement. So the question itself doesn't tell us what it is, but we can actually calculate it. Because we know that in order to meet the reserve requirement, the bank is going to put whatever fraction it has to of deposits into reserve. And because we know the value of required reserves and we know the value of demand deposits, we know that $2,000 must be the exact percent of demand deposits the bank has to keep at the bank. And so we can just figure out, for number one here, we just need to know what percent of $20,000 is $2,000, right? And when we do that, the answer is 10%. So the required reserve ratio is 10% because we've put 10% of those demand deposits, $20,000, into required reserves. And so we know it's got to be 10% because a bank wouldn't put any more into required reserves than it has to, right? So that's $2,000. So that's the 10%. Number two is a question that you'll see often on APFRQs, and it's one that students frequently get wrong. It says, will M1 money supply initially increase, decrease, or stay the same? And the key word here is initially, not after the bank starts loaning money out, but just initially, okay? So we need to remember what is included in M1. So M1 is equal to, we have currency, I'm going to abbreviate that CURR, plus checking or checkable deposits. Now, yes, it also includes traveler's checks, but we're just going to ignore that for simplicity's sake, okay? So what is Bob actually doing here? Well, Bob's money, before it goes into the bank, is in currency, right? So that $1,000 is currently sitting in the currency part of the M1 money supply. When Bob deposits the money, he's moving it from currency into deposits, right? So M1 isn't changing here. All we're doing is reclassifying that money from being currency to deposit. So the answer here is M1's going to stay the same. We haven't added any money to the money supply. We're just changing the classification, what category the money belongs to. Instead of currency, it's now deposit. So the answer here is stay the same. A lot of students want to say increase because they don't have an understanding of M1. that M1 includes both currency and deposits, and so M1, and for that matter M2, would not change. So that's the answer to number 2. All right, I'm going to use my eraser here and get rid of some stuff so we can make some room here for number 3. And I'm trying to get rid of, there we go. All right, we'll do a different color here. Let's do green now. So for number 3, it says how much is the required reserves after the deposit. So in other words, we need to recalculate what the required reserves are based upon depositing that $1,000. So not as difficult as it may seem. So we know that Bob deposits $1,000 into the bank, right? And so when the bank receives this $1,000, the first thing they're going to think of is, oh my gosh, we've got to make sure we meet the reserve requirement with this deposit. So we've got to put 10% of that into required reserves, and that's going to be $100 because 10% of 1,000 is $100. And then the other 90% is going to initially go into excess reserves because we don't know if the bank is going to decide to loan it out or not. Some people may be tempted to say, oh, that's going to go into loans. We don't know if they're going to loan it out. It first has to go into excess reserves, and then when the bank makes the decision to loan it out, we can move it then into loans. So 90% of 1,000 is $900. So we can see that $100 of it is going to go into required reserves, and the other $900 is going to go into excess reserves. So we're going to add the $100 to the already $2,000 that exists in required reserves, and that is going to give us a new required reserve total of $2,100. And we've actually already done number 4 as well, because now it wants to know what's the value of excess reserves after the deposit. We calculated that. It's 90% of 1,000, the remaining part of Bob's deposit. So we're going to add that 900 to what already exists in excess reserves, and that's $3,000. And so the new value of excess reserves is going to be $3,900. And so again, if you understand the vocabulary, it does make doing these bank balance sheets easier if you understand what each item in the chart means. That's very important. And so finally for number 5, it says how much more can the bank initially lend out here? Okay, how much more can the bank initially lend out? So we've got to be careful here, right? We've got to be very careful here on how we think about this. The key word here is initially, right? So we know right now the bank is loaning out $15,000, right? But let's say they want to do more loans. Well, where can they get that money from? Well, they can't take it out of required reserves because remember the government says you have to keep that money there to meet people want to withdraw their money. You can't touch that money. So the only money that's left is what's ever in excess reserves. And we just calculated the new value of excess reserves as $3,900. And so the answer here for number 5 is going to be $3,900. That is how much the bank can initially lend out beyond the $15,000 that's already being loaned out currently. Now I do realize as I'm looking at the practice that I left out number 6, which is unfortunate because that's a really good question. So we'll add number 6 here. And number 6 asks how much will the money supply, the maximum change in the money supply from the deposit. So what we know is that when Bob deposits the money, right, $100 of this goes into required reserves, right? We already said that. And then the other 900 could be loaned out, right? So that 900, when it gets loaned out, we talked about this with the money multiplier, it can be put in another bank, and then 90% of that can be loaned out, and then put in another bank, and then 90% of that can loan out, and they just got this chain reaction of loans. So what you want to do here is we're going to take the $900 that can be loaned out and times that by the multiplier. Well, how do we get the multiplier? Well, it's 1 divided by the reserve requirement as a fraction. 10% is the reserve requirement. So as a fraction, that's 1 over 10. So this is 900 times 10, which gives you a maximum change in the money supply of $9,000. And that's number 6. Okay? So you do need to be careful there because a lot of students want to take 1,000 times 10, but that's not correct because $100 of that deposit can't be loaned out. It goes in required reserves, and so you can't multiply what's not being lent out. So you got to be careful there when you're thinking about maximum changes in the money supply. All right, that's the first one. This will be a longer video. We're already up to 11 minutes here. But again, I think it's important to help you understand each of these in turn. All right, so we've got the next one here. And again, we've got Bob, but this time, same balance sheet, but this time Bob's going to withdraw $3,000 from this bank. And the first question, very similar to one that we had on the last bank balance sheet practice problem. Will M1 money supply initially increase, decrease, or stay the same? And hopefully we know now that the answer is going to be stay the same. And so the question is, why is that? Well, we talked about it on the last problem. We're now just moving the money from checking deposits into currency. We're just changing what category of the M1 money supply we're putting that $3,000 in. It's no longer in deposits. It's now in Bob's pocket as currency. And so the M1 money supply is not going to change. It's going to stay the same. And notice the key word here, initially, right? Because you may be thinking in your head, but yeah, when banks can't loan that money out anymore, isn't that going to change the money supply? Yes, down the line. But the key word here is initially. What's initially going to happen? The answer is nothing. Okay, the M1 money supply is not going to change because we're just changing the category of the money from deposits to currency. All right, now number 2 says how much is the required reserves? I apologize for the way that question's worded because it makes you think that, well, duh, it's $2,000. I can read a chart. What I meant was how much is the required reserves after the withdrawal. Hopefully that came through. But so, little trickier than with a deposit, okay? Because we kind of have to work backwards here. So let's think about this. When Bob withdraws $3,000 from the bank, that's going to change demand deposits down to $17,000, right? Because $3,000 of deposits are no longer there. And so now we've got to, knowing that number, we then have to figure out what percent of that money has to go in required reserves. Luckily, we kept the chart the same as on the last question. And remember, on the last question, we calculated the reserve requirement to be 10%. So to get required reserves, we need to take 10% of 17,000. And when we do that, the answer is going to be $1,700. That is the value of the required reserves now that we have demand deposits of $17,000. So withdrawals are a little trickier because you do have to kind of work backwards a little bit, but that's why we're doing this practice so you can see that in person. Okay, the third question is a little harder still. How much is the excess reserves? Okay, so how do we think about this? Okay, so we know that there's $17,000 in demand deposits. Okay, so we know that. This $17,000 has to be equal to actually 3 categories put together. Okay, you may be thinking only 2, but there's actually 3. That $17,000 on the liability side corresponds to required reserves and, yes, excess reserves, but also loans, right? Because this is how the bank can use that $17,000. They can either put some of it in required reserves, they can put some in excess reserves, or they can put some in loans. And they're actually doing all three here. We already know that 1,700 of that is going into required reserves. We also know that the loans are $15,000, and we have no information to indicate that that's going to change. So we know that $17,000 has to be equal to 1,700 plus the value of excess reserves plus the value of loans. And so the question here is, well, what number added to 1,700 and 15,000 is going to give me 17,000? And the answer here is $300. So what we notice here is that excess reserves shrinks by a lot now. Why is that? Well, because the bank is trying to maintain $15,000 worth of loans. And so what we're basically saying here is in order to keep that $15,000 of loans going, they're going to have to shrink their excess reserves by quite a bit in order to maintain that $15,000 of loans. So the answer here is $300. That's tricky. That's really tricky because you have to make sure you understand that demand deposits, what the bank can do with that money is they can put it in required reserves. They're going to put 10% of that in. They can put it in loans. We already know that's $15,000. And then we got to figure out where's the rest going to go. And there's $300 that's going to be left in excess reserves. Okay. Now what we're saying here, number 4 is interesting because it says assume Bob burned the money. What is the maximum change in the money supply? So Bob now has this money, okay? And this money can no longer be deposited, withdrawn, nothing, right? Because Bob's going to burn the money, okay? Now, that money, because it can't be deposited ever again, it can never be loaned out again. And then when that person loans it out, they're not going to be able to put it in another bank for someone else to loan out. And so there's this multiplier effect. But this time, we are going to take the $3,000, the full amount, times the multiplier, which we calculated in the last question to be 10, 1 over the reserve requirement. And so the maximum change is going to be a decrease of $30,000. Now, why is it that we use $30,000 here instead of taking 10% off and using, what would that be, $2,700? Why did we not use $2,700 here? The answer is because Bob doesn't have to meet a reserve requirement, right? Bob's just a regular Joe on the street, right? He doesn't have to meet a reserve requirement. And so by Bob igniting that $3,000, it can never be deposited again. It can never be withdrawn again. And so the full $3,000 times the multiplier is what's going to get destroyed here. And so $30,000 of money in the money supply is no longer going to be there. So it's a decrease of $30,000. All right, and that is number 2, or if you want to think of it that way, practice problem 2. All right, the last one is an APFRQ, and so this one gives you probably the best indication of what it would look like on the AP exam. They've done bank balance sheets many times. I'd say it comes up every year or two, so there's a good chance that we'll see it this year on the AP macro exam. So we got another bank balance sheet. We changed the numbers this time, and it wants to know what is the reserve requirement. Well, we've already practiced how to do that with the first problem, right? We know that the bank is putting $10,000 of this total $100,000 in required reserves. So $10,000 must be the exact percent of demand deposits to meet that reserve requirement. And so for number 1, we just need to take $100,000 and figure out what percent of, what percent of 100,000 is 10,000, and that is going to be 10%. So the demand deposit here is 10%. You could have also found that by taking $10,000 divided by $100,000. That gives you 10%. So that's number 1. Okay, number 2, 3 parts here. So Louise is going to withdraw $5,000. I don't know why I put a question mark there, as if we're not sure he's doing that. He is doing that. I apologize. But A says, by how much will this bank's reserves change? And we're talking total reserves, which is the sum of required and excess reserves. Well, if demand deposits are decreasing by 5,000, that means, if assuming we're going to keep loans the same, which we are, that means total reserves are going to have to decrease. I'll make this 2A, decrease by $5,000. Okay, so yeah, you're taking it out of demand deposits, so we've got to shrink reserves by 5,000 on the other side to keep it balanced. So we lose $5,000 in reserves. And then 2B is what is the impact on M1? And again, for the third time, we're going to say there's none. Why? Because we're moving from deposits to currency. We're just changing the category that we're using for M1. So there's no change there. And then for 2C, this is goes back to the last question with the value of excess reserves. So we have to go back and recalculate required reserves and then use that with loans to get excess reserves. So let's go through this again. So we know that demand deposits have shrunk by $5,000. So this is going to be $9,500. We know that 10% of 9,500 has to now go in required reserves. So required reserves are now going to be 900. Actually, hang on one second. Okay, sorry, I made a mistake here. I paused the video for a second because I was trying to figure out why I was getting a weird number. This should be 95,000. So again, you got to be careful with your math there, right? And so 10% of 95,000 is going to be $9,500. That is the new value of required reserves. I do apologize for that. And so now that we have our new required reserves, we know that total deposits has to be equal to our required reserves, 9,500, plus the value of the excess reserves, that's what we need to know, plus 85,000, which is loans. Because again, this $95,000 of deposits can only go in one of three places. Either it goes in required reserves, excess reserves, or loans. That's it. So we need to solve for ER, and excess reserves is going to be $500 to make that equation work. So again, another practice problem very similar to on the last question. And then finally on number 3, this is a little new for us. What can the bank do if John wants to withdraw more than is available in excess reserves? So what we're saying here is John's coming to the bank. Let's say he wants to withdraw $600. We only have $500 in excess reserves. What can the bank do? And basically what you would answer here is the bank can borrow from another bank, right? Go to another bank, say, hey, I've got a depositor, just one. He wants more money than I have in reserves. Can you lend me some money? That's what a bank could do to solve that particular problem. And again, with one depositor needing to do this, that's not a big deal, right? The reserve requirement is going to help us, figure that out. But, the point of the reserve requirement is to prevent a mass number of people swarming the bank, and no bank is going to help you if they know that your bank is in huge trouble all on its own. So that is 3 practice problems with bank balance sheets. I encourage you to ask questions when you don't understand. Just try as many of these as you can. I will certainly give you even more practice than this between the homework and whatnot. But again, the more you do these, the easier they get. It's just each one can ask something a little different, and that's where you've got to make sure you're following along. So that's all for this video on practicing with bank balance sheets. Until next time, have a great day.